Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dawn Numdu. I'm your host for this evening session of hashtag Gather to Grow here with Food from Zanzi on Twitter Spaces. And I'm really excited about tonight's topic, soil erosion and overgrazing. And I'm going to maybe ask my one speaker who is here just to introduce herself and tell us more about what she does. She's a soil scientist and senior analyst in sustainable agriculture for Green Cape, and I'm so happy to have her with me. Sikolise, if you can just tell us a bit about who you are, what you do in agriculture, and where you started on this amazing journey. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Don. My name is Sikolise Mcinga from the Eastern Cape. That is where my love for agriculture was ignited, looking at those little gardens back in Eastern Cape, back home, where people would do it for subsistence purposes. My thought was that how can we then transform all of this to agribusiness? And that's what triggered the whole love for agriculture. So I then enrolled for a degree in soil science at the University of Fort Hare, which I finished, ended up graduating all the way up to master's, majoring in soil science. I'm currently trying to finish my PhD, hopefully by the end of this year, but it's in the broader agriculture topic, but obviously still focusing a bit on soil science and agronomy. I currently work as a senior analyst in sustainable agriculture for Green Cape, where we are looking into pushing basically agriculture into a more sustainable kind of production and transforming everything to become green as it should have been a while ago. So that is what we're currently busy with. And we basically develop knowledge products, which are called market intelligence reports, industry briefs on what's happening in the industry.
Thank you so much. And it's an absolute pleasure to have you with me. I'm always advocating to have at least one female speaker on a specific topic in my space. And I'm so happy that you're able to join me. So thank you so much for being here. Hopefully the rest will join. I know that Tapelo Piri, who is also a fertilizer specialist focusing on regenerative agricultural practices, is going to be joining me. And then I have one other guest, but I'm not sure. Load shedding kind of really messes with our schedules. But maybe as a start, let's just give our audience and everyone listening a breakdown of overgrazing and soil erosion and the impact it has on agricultural production and food security, just as a start. Broad overview, I know this, we will break it down as the hour goes along, but maybe just as a start, really say if you can just take us through that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I will just speak briefly on the topics because I understand that there's also other people who are going to be joining. And I'll try to be not as scientific in my explanations of what I understand soil erosion, overgrazing, and how all of that impacts food production and basically the ultimate goal, which is food security. So for soil erosion is a natural process and it is as a result of the detachment of soil materials, and it could be as a result of wind or by water. So it's been identified as one of the major problems that are confronting South African producers. And it has been indicated that over 70 or 85% of the country's soils have been affected by varying intensities of soil erosion. So how it ties in nicely with overgrazing is that overgrazing, on the other hand, is exposing soils to intensive grazing, making or whatever kind of grass species that were being grazed by the animals are being completely unavailable, leaving patches on the soil. So what overgrazing does is that it exacerbates soil erosion, which ultimately leads to your different types of soil erosions, mostly gullies, which then make the soil unfertile, which at some point, at worst case scenarios, complete removal of the topsoil, leaving only your rocks and making it, you're going to be unable to plant on it. How that affects now food security, which is the bigger picture, is that in situations like that, it basically means that there's complete removal of soil fertility and basically a complete removal of the topsoil. Therefore, you cannot do anything on it. The soil becomes barren. So that's the worst case scenario in the context of overgrazing and soil erosion.
Thank you so much for setting the scene for us. And I said I wouldn't put you on the spot and have you answer all of my questions that I had lined up for our speakers. You spoke about the major effects it has, but how can we sort of break that down and maybe just more on ground farm production level? What is the impact that it has on farmers and specifically developing farmers? What is it like day to day, the impact and the effect of overgrazing?
Overgrazing, obviously, it exists at varying intensities, like I highlighted. And one of the things that is like that end up causing overgrazing is mismanaging grazing land by overstocking it. So that basically means that in a piece of land, there's a certain number of animals that need to graze on it. And so what happens is that if you overgraze or if you put more than the carrying capacity of the field, you end up overgrazing that space. So I'll make an example with cattle as an example. So cattle in love with one grass species, right, which is called the Eragrostis cavula. So in a piece of land, if there's other types of species, and obviously the first preference will be their type, which they like, which will be your Eragrostis cavula as an example. So what happens is that in that piece of land, you'll find that you will no longer find that Eragrostis cavula, and then it's going to be other grass species. For an example, your Themeda triandra, or even the ones that cattle are not interested in even grazing, your Cynodon or whatever. So what happens in that situation is that now there will be patches which now introduces invasive species, which now introduces an area that is encroached by alien species. And at times, your acacia carew, now you'll find small shrubs developing in a piece of land that was initially a grazing land. So all of those things translate to now a piece of land that is basically barren, because in a situation like that, you will find that now there has been effects on water availability, because now the piece of land was initially covered with some grass species or some species. Now it is now bare. What happens is that it's now being exposed to water losses. It's now being exposed to being blown away by the wind. Now what happens in that situation is that over time there's complete removal of topsoil. And this results obviously in situations where farmers can no longer use that piece of land for any kind of agricultural productivity. And you can imagine how that affects your subsistence production, how it affects food production and availability. So those are some of the breakdowns that you will find in the context of your local farmer.
Thank you so much for that breakdown. Tapelo, I know that you're struggling with your network. Thank you so much for joining nonetheless. I'm going to talk about 3 ways to reduce overgrazing. Police, I'm going to have to ask you again, seeing that Tapelo is hiding there. You can just do one and then I'll leave the rest to him.
I'll speak on the proper management of that piece of land that you wanting to expose your animals to. Obviously, the one thing that leads to overgrazing will be your improper management of that piece of land. So for you to be able to mitigate that is by introducing a system of rotational grazing. So in rotational grazing systems is you put your animals in one piece of land where they're going to graze, and then you pause or remove the animals from that certain piece of land, and then you put them onto a different piece of land to allow for that land that you had previously introduced them to recover, right? So that's one way. And the other way is through the introduction of sustainable pasture practices. So by that, it means that you develop a system that works for whatever animals that you are keeping, which are grazing on a particular piece of land. So like I'm saying, one would be rotational grazing, and which will basically reduce the pressure on that one particular piece of land.
Thank you so much for that. Sitlise, if you're still with me, we've given everyone listening a clear understanding of the effects of it and what it's caused. But maybe you can just give us, a breakdown. How can we also just explain this to people and also talk more about how we can increase diversity of plant species if we do plant other crops, and how we can diversify in that way and give people more hands-on practical advice to do that?
So you're asking some of the best practices that we can adopt long term to either prevent
Yes.
overgrazing. All right. So I think before we can talk about the long term management practices, I think it's also important to highlight what are some of the indicators that, okay, no, now we are overgrazing. Maybe it's time to maybe pause grazing on this particular piece of land and then introduce rotational grazing. So one of the things that happened, like I mentioned, that one would be that one particular species that your animals like, it will start depleting over time. And then you now find encroachment of your bushes. Your acacia karoo is an example. And now all these other palatable tall grass species are now becoming sparse or at times even non-existent because they are the ones that are being repeatedly grazed. So to avoid that, there's one way that you can look at it. And one is that you need to consider different styles of grazing management that you can choose from. I think I've highlighted rotational grazing. There's also mob grazing. There's also cell or holistic grazing as an example. So you evaluate which type of grazing system that is going to work for you and the kind of system that you have. I personally prefer, not necessarily prefer, but I think one that's more practical is rotational grazing, where you have different pieces of land and then you just introduce them. You can do this seasonally. You can do this over a period of time where you can say, maybe now it's time to rotate your animals and then you move them from this one particular piece of land to another one. I think that's one holistic way that you can actually manage overgrazing.
Thank you so much. Tapelo, can you hear us now to be able to join and just tell us who you are?
Hi everyone, Tapelo Piri Jr. I'm an innovator within the agri-space, trying to help farmers to move into more sustainable ways of farming, looking into also helping farmers to tap into the regenerative agricultural space. So that's the base of what I do within the agri-space.
Thanks, Tapelo. And I think colleague Sikolisa has given us a very nice overview of what farmers should understand. And she's also given us, ways to control and mitigate overgrazing and soil erosion. But maybe just your take and also maybe just more of the solutions that we should be looking at to be able to reduce overgrazing from your side. Thanks.
One of the major solutions that we can look into to help with the problem of overgrazing, we need to check if there is enough irrigation within the systems in which our animals are grazing on. That can be one. And secondly, we can reduce overgrazing by ensuring that we do cover the land as soon as the cattle or whatever livestock has finished grazing on a certain portion. We can move into another portion, which that means we can integrate or mitigate that by doing rotational grazing, having cattle in one area for a certain period of time, then moving them into another area, whereas the previous area now will start grow grass to cover the soil. That's one of the ways to mitigate overgrazing.
And then in South Africa, and specifically developing farmers, when they come to a specific piece of land and maybe it's a new farm that they've just bought or they've gotten it through by the state or whichever means they've now gotten this piece of land, what are the practices that should be done from day one?
If they're looking into livestock or farming, crop farming.
Let's start with livestock.
Going into livestock, surely the first thing is to check if there is cover on that land. So if there is enough grass or any form of vegetation, I think that has to be the first thing for farmers to look into. Then secondly, could be trying to find ways on how they can divide that piece of land into different sections so that they can be able to practice rotational grazing at any point when they want to start with their farms.
Thanks, Tapelo. Thanks for breaking that down. Are there any areas that I may have missed? Anything that we should be focusing on this topic? I think also just how we kind of bring into if a farmer is not really farming sustainably or using sustainable practices, how do we do the changeover? Maybe some practical advice around that. We spoke about it briefly last week as well. What are some of the steps that we could pass that they take? How do they do it? Is it something that happens slowly? Is something that they can invest in and do, from the beginning and just a sudden changeover? What should we be thinking about?
In my experiences, in the two groups of farmers that you spoke about, number one, the first ones who are transitioning or who are getting into the system of farming, it's easier to convince or it's easier to adopt sustainable farming practices on those ones because they have not been exposed to intensive agricultural production mechanisms, which are either sustainable or not sustainable. So the nicest thing is that they could make that one big decision to farm sustainably. And the reality is that the word that's been going around there is that it's very expensive to farm sustainably. But this thing is only in the first or second year of your production. And then from there on, you start experiencing or you start seeing the outputs. And the nicest thing is that it's long term. So those groups of farmers, they just need to make that one big decision to choose to farm sustainably. And there's different ways that have been described as sustainable farming. In the case of crop production, there's conservation agriculture, which focuses quite a lot on diversification of the different species that you're going to have on your piece of land, which talks about minimal soil disturbance, which talks about mulch or residue retention. So it's easier to convince or it's easier to tap into this kind of farming if you are a new and emerging farmer. And then on the other side, where you find people who have been farming for a couple of years, we have seen that it is not very easy for them to transition to sustainable agricultural production. But through the different systems that have been introduced, not only by the government, but by other platforms as well, where there's a lot of information dissemination platforms, such as these ones, you find that there's a slow adoption rate, but they are coming to the other side, which is beautiful. And this is as simple as keeping residues whenever you have planted whatever, if you are in crop production. If you've planted maize, as an example, instead of removing the stalks, you leave them. And in that way, the soil replenishes itself. You start slowly. And the nicest thing is that you will reap the benefits of tapping into sustainable agricultural production, either in crops or in livestock production.
Definitely, it is quite interesting to see this conversation happening more and more and in more of these spaces. And it's kind of a buzzword at the moment, but how it happens practically is something else altogether. So thank you so much for just sharing that. Tapelo, maybe just in your experience working with farmers and specifically in your field, which is producing organic fertilizers, how do you see it moving or trending towards with developing farmers and small producers? Thanks.
I think with me, it's a bit of a different case on how we're approaching it because we got to a point of understanding why farmers don't transition and what could be the best way that could make them transition. So we're looking into the broader industries, we're looking into the broader developments, not only in agriculture, but in business as a whole. So we're targeting farmers with the aim of helping them transition for carbon credits. So because of that, there will be another source of income that they will be earning by just farming sustainably. They are more motivated to follow through that route. And again, we're looking into working with different companies on regenerative projects so that we can help them offset their carbon credits because now the biggest economy that we're moving into is the carbon economy. We're looking into ESG projects whereby companies will be bound to work with small scale farmers so that they can help them to offset their carbon credits. So there is a bit of balance, but the transition is very slow because of the information that farmers have. It's still the traditional information that they used to have. It's still the same way that they believe things need to be happening that way. But on the other side, we're trying to push, surely with the government as well. There will be programs that will be coming on board for small scale farmers looking into resilience when we try to solve the issue of climate change using farmlands. And the other way around will be finding companies that will give incentives to farmers who will just farm organically or sustainably. So there will be different mechanisms that will be used.
Thank you so much. Just on that point, if I am not farming sustainably and I'm looking to get either carbon credits and how that would work, what is the type of paperwork or things that I would need to have in place? If it's something that I'm investing in long term, would that set me back if I'm transitioning and if I don't have that much land available? How do we kind of encourage the shift in thinking so that it happens faster and we're not waiting another 10, 20 years to get to where I think all of you are, both of my speakers are at this point, encouraging it in terms of your work that you do day to day. So maybe you can take this one.
That's what the government has been wanting to tap into now, which is basically they're disincentivizing people that are not into sustainable agricultural production. So that is one way that we are getting quite a lot of people now getting a lot more interested in carbon farming. And I mean, there's intricate ways in which all of that production is measured. So you can't cheat and say that you have tapped into sustainable agricultural production when you have not. I mean, the credits will speak for themselves. And we've been in engagements as well with a lot of companies that are looking to tap into that space, considering as well smallholder farmers and not just your large scale commercial farmers. So what's beautiful about that is that no one is being left behind in this transition that we are wanting to get into. Everybody is we basically, even the government is pulling everyone into it. So yeah, I think that's one mechanism that we can ensure that people are tapping into sustainable agricultural production. And the nicest thing is that, or well, the biggest catch is that carbon credits will give you money. So everybody wants that extra money. So everyone is now interested, slowly wanting to tap into that. Others are changing their production mechanisms to accommodate them so that they can be able to trade. So that's one way to look at it.
Thank you so much. And I think we wrap up, just last and final comments as part of the conversation. I think I'm going to maybe cut it a bit shorter tonight, and maybe pick it up again once load shedding isn't messing with our schedules and people can actually engage more on the topic. But Tapelo, maybe I'm going to start with you.
On the issue of erosion and overgrazing, I think the solution is one. The solution is just to move to regenerative agriculture so that everyone can just build healthy soils and we focus more on carbon, not only as a tool to make money, but as one of the tools to combat climate change. So there will be a lot of money for those who will be transitioning. And surely those who will be transitioning faster, they will make more money than those who will come late. So what I will say to farmers that are joining us here is just to find ways, consult on how they can start to transition to regenerative agriculture.
Thanks, Tapelo. And maybe you can also just share your details of how to connect with you for this type of support after this. But maybe, Sikolise, maybe just your take on it, looking at the work that you're doing day to day, also your final comments and advice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dom, for this amazing opportunity to speak in this platform. So my parting message would really be, I think we have been given all the resources, knowledge products, that is. And I think people in the agriculture space, and not just in the agriculture space, but in the entire value chain, have been doing enormous work so that we can change our production mechanisms. And I want to support Tapelo in exactly saying that the one way that we can ensure a good, productive working system, sustainable and resilient agricultural production system is if we tap into regenerative agricultural mechanisms. And that is unpacked either in crop production or in livestock management or in any form of agriculture that you can think about. And the benefits are that you will still benefit from all of it because there is a financial benefit that is attached to it. And there's a long-term and sustainable side of it, which is where you're able to produce for long periods of time. Basically, if we start tapping into regenerative agricultural practices today, we are leaving wealth for the generations to come.
Thank you so much. And if people would like to connect with you and more of the work that you do at Green Cape, how does one do that?
So I am Sikolise Mcinga on LinkedIn and all other social media platforms. And I will be happy to leave my other details, my email address, if there's someone wants to get in touch.
For sure. People can also just DM me and Food from Zanzi if you'd like to know more about how to connect. I think the question around regenerative agricultural practices can be had in another space, have touched on it, very briefly in our other sessions, but I think it is something that I can put as part of my plan and a conversation that we can have. We have had many of these episodes on our weekly Farmers podcast as well. So where Tapelo was also featured on a number of times. And my editor was telling me, Sikolise, that we want to feature you on Food from Zanzi. So we'll see your beautiful face on the website soon enough. I think you're absolutely amazing. And thank you so much for holding the floor and holding us in the conversation tonight. I know that the network was really keeping our other speakers away and Tapelo only being able to join later, but thank you so much. Tapelo, maybe just your last comments on the topic and how people can connect with you. Thanks.
Okay, I'll just drop a text there.
Okay, for sure. So you'll tweet. Okay, cool. Thanks, Tapelo,
Sure.
and thank you so much for being part of the conversation. You're like my go-to when it comes to fertilizer. So I'll be sure to keep you in my contact list, and anything regenerative agriculture, fertilizers, organic fertilizers, you're my go-to. So I'll just keep you there as well. Lisa, it was so beautiful to have you with me as well. I'm looking forward to also keeping you within this network and to have you join us again at a later stage. For now, because of network, I'm going to wrap up early and hopefully we can have another conversation on this topic at a later stage and make it a little bit more engaging with our audience as well. Thank you for everyone who was here and who contributed as well. So thank you so much to you. And thank you for listening. Have a great evening. Thank you so much for joining me here every week from my side. Donum, have a lovely evening and everything of the best with all that you do within agriculture.